And thank you for taking time out of your schedules to participate in today's ACT-IAC webinar. We do hope that the information provided today is a valuable resource for you. Just a couple of brief housekeeping notes before we begin. At the bottom of your screen are multiple application engagement tools that you can use to enhance your experience. All of the boxes on your screen are resizable. Please feel free to manipulate those boxes to fit your preferences. You can find answers to some common technical issues through the Help Engagement tool at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question for the speakers, please post it in the Q&A box on your screen. We will try to answer as many questions as possible during the webinar. Finally, this presentation is being recorded and will be made available for review on demand in the coming days. Thank you again for joining. And now, let's get started with today's discussion.
So George Eastman founded Kodak at the end of the 19th century. The company dominated the photography industry for over 100 years and became one of this country's best-known brands. In 1975, Kodak invented the first handheld digital camera, which didn't require film. And this is a picture of it here. But Kodak chose not to pursue this disruptive technology because they feared it would hurt their film business, which was the real moneymaker for Kodak at the time. By 2012, the once dominant Kodak was struggling to survive as a business and filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. In 1997, Toyota released the Prius, the first hybrid gas-electric car produced for the mass market, people like us. Years before, Toyota had realized the hybrid car was a fundamentally different kind of car than their other models and had separated out the Prius design and build group from the rest of their conventional product lines. 14 years later, GM released their entry into the hybrid market with a Chevy Volt. They hadn't taken Toyota's approach. They left the design and build of the Volt inside GM's traditionally functionally oriented organizational structure: drivetrain, chassis, interior, etc. The sales of the Toyota Prius so far outpaced the Chevy Volt that GM decided to discontinue the Volt in 2019, less than 8 years after they had released it. As part of Operation Iraqi Freedom, coalition forces invaded Iraq on March 20th, 2003. An insurgency followed that invasion, and after a lull to regroup and reorganize, the insurgency started expanding in the spring of 2004. U.S. and coalition forces had a difficult time getting ahead of the insurgents. The U.S. forces weren't responding to changes or acting on intelligence fast enough because of their conventional command and control decision-making and communication flows. Recognizing this, General Stanley McChrystal, the commander of the Joint Special Operations Task Force in Iraq at the time, made some radical changes to how U.S. forces operated, communicated, made decisions, and were structured. These changes sped up the operational tempo of the war and eventually produced more stability in the region, allowing the drawdown and eventual complete withdrawal of U.S. forces by 2011. Trent, why are we sharing these seemingly unrelated stories?
Thanks, Jeff. We're sharing them because we think these are relevant to us today. These stories can give us insight into trends and help us better deliver on our missions. Jeff and I believe, to paraphrase this quote from William Wordsworth, that the past informs the present, and our understanding of what's happening now in the present shapes the future. If we want to live better in the future, as Wordsworth suggests, then we need to understand the past and we need to learn from it. Each of these stories offers a very specific lesson about how enterprises can be structured and operate to deliver a better future for their missions and the people that they serve. Before we get into the details of that, we're going to introduce ourselves. I'm Trent Hone. I'm the head of Excella Labs. That's our innovation engine. And I'm fascinated by how organizations learn and improve. I wrote Learning War, an award-winning history to show how the Navy learned in the 20th century, and former Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral John Richardson, used it to help craft the Navy's high-velocity learning effort, one of his signature priorities. Over to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Trent. And I'm Jeff Gallimore, CTIO and co-founder of Excella. Officially, the T in the I stands for Technology and Innovation. Unofficially, T in the I stands for Trouble and Instigation. And my boss would tell you that I'm good at my job. I'm also an advisor to IT Revolution, which is Gene Kim's company, for those of you in the DevOps community. That's the company that brought you books like the Phoenix Project and the DevOps Handbook, if you're familiar with those. I'm also a co-organizer of DevOps Days DC, which after 1 year back, or 1 year off, is back again in 2021 on September 16th and 17th. Now, the big idea we want to share with you is that we see a number of trends that are real today that are shaping how enterprises are structured and how they operate. The trends we're sharing fall into two broad categories. The first category includes trends primarily related to changes in technology. The second category includes trends primarily related to how organizations are structured and how they work. While we believe each trend is significant individually, it's the confluence of all these trends working together that we see having such huge potential to shape the future. So let's get into those trends. Now remember back to the Kodak story. The lesson here is that even though Kodak invented a disruptive technology with the digital camera, they were unwilling to explore it because they were too protective of their core business. They did not allow that innovation into their business, and they ultimately suffered the consequences of that decision. We think 5G is one of those same kind of disruptive technologies. Now, to give you the basics of 5G, it delivers higher peak data speeds, lower latency, more reliability, more capacity, and better availability over 4G. And just to put it in perspective, how much faster 5G is over 4G, it would take you about 3 seconds to download your favorite movie over 5G. And unless your favorite movie is The Godfather or Avengers Endgame, in which case it might take another second or two. The reason we think 5G is such an important technological trend is consider what changed when we shifted from landlines to mobile, or from 2G, I can text people, to 4G, I can watch Netflix on my phone. Those shifts enabled entirely new applications, ways to engage with customers and stakeholders, and ways of working. Just as an example of what 5G can enable, the picture here is from Volvo. An operator is driving that front-end loader in the picture remotely over 5G. The operator is at one site, and the equipment is at another. The next technological trend is event-driven architecture. Many systems today use what are called RESTful APIs. So one system makes a call to another system and waits for a response. It requires that one system know about the other in advance and how to communicate with it. It creates dependencies and the need for a lot of coordination. Event-driven architecture changes that model. Instead of using a request and response between two systems or services, an event-driven architecture uses, events. I could dig into all the technical details, but the reason event-driven architecture is important is that it can reduce technical, information, and organizational dependencies that increase complexity, risk, cost, time, all the things we don't want when it comes to building, delivering, and operating systems and services. I already touched on why event-driven architecture can be valuable because it reduces dependencies, which in turn reduces complexity, which in turn increases scalability, resilience, flexibility, all the things we do want when it comes to building, delivering, and operating systems and services. This is exactly why LinkedIn moved to an event-driven architecture 10 years ago, because it was experiencing the problems that came with increasing complexity of its expanding systems and services, as well as the increasing traffic that came with scaling the business. Going to an event-driven architecture helped them address all that. And for those of you who might be familiar, this is where the open source Apache Kafka product came from. Event-driven architecture even improves the auditability of a system because those events serve as a record of what has happened over time. And event-driven architecture is especially effective at reducing dependencies, complexity, and risk across organizational boundaries. This means that event-driven architecture can both enable change because it's less risky to make changes and protect from changes because our systems and services are decoupled and insulated from those changes. The last technological trend we want to cover is artificial intelligence. You would have probably had to have been living in a cave not to have heard of AI by now. But with the pandemic, some of us may have been doing exactly that. To provide a working definition of AI, it's the simulation of human intelligence demonstrated by machines to include what looks to us as learning, reasoning, and perception. Computers can be taught to perform certain kinds of tasks without needing to program them with explicit rules to perform those tasks. They can essentially learn over time and become better at those tasks just like a human. Now, the reason AI is such a transformational technology is that for certain kinds of tasks, AI can handle more data, more complexity, and more scale more efficiently than humans. And to give you an example of AI that's close to home, the USPTO has built AI applications to help with classification of patents and to help examiners in conducting research on prior art. AI doesn't replace the examiner or do the examiner's job. AI augments the examiner, automates a lot of the heavy lifting associated with the examiner's job, and frees up the examiner for the high-value cognitive work to support the USPTO's mission. And that's the big deal with AI. We can use computers to automate away the repetitive and toilsome tasks, as well as tasks that might just be impractical to do any other way. So humans, you and I, can spend more time and energy on more valuable and rewarding work. Trent, why don't you take it from here to cover the organizational trends?
Thanks, Jeff. Let's remember back to the Prius. The lesson from this story is that creating cross-functional product teams with a product orientation will deliver better and faster results than a more traditional functional organization. That's how Toyota outperformed Chevrolet, and that's a core aspect of how Toyota approaches new product development. It's one of the reasons, a very important reason, why they have been so successful. We call this a project-to-product transformation. It requires reorienting to a product mentality. Products are longer-lived efforts with dedicated teams that work together to accomplish high-level goals, objectives of the organization. Product orientation is a great approach in more dynamic environments where the best way forward is uncertain or new technologies have to be integrated and taken advantage of. This is because product teams can experiment. That allows them to learn faster. To use product teams, lay out the goals, and let the teams determine how best to deliver. Let them self-organize. Making this the default approach typically requires changes in how we organize, fund, and manage work, but it can be very rewarding. And one of the reasons it's rewarding is because it creates better alignment with the mission. We demonstrated this in our work at DHS's U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS. USCIS verifications needed to address two key business metrics. They had to reduce their case backlog, and they had to decrease their case processing times. We worked together to create product teams, gave them a clear line of sight to end users, and as those teams experimented, they learned how best to accomplish those two goals, reducing the case backlog and decreasing case processing time. They succeeded, and their rapid experiments allowed USCIS to learn more about how to deliver on their mission and win. Now, to the war in Iraq and fighting the insurgency. The lesson here is that to achieve agility at scale, you need to embrace radically different decision-making approaches. You need to create a network that rapidly shares information so that you can confidently push decision-making authority down to where new information is emerging and being discovered. Gartner calls this an intelligent, composable business, one that is made up of interchangeable, cross-functional components, which employ discovery-based approaches, networked information sharing, and significant levels of autonomy to seize new opportunities as they emerge. The model for this, the real-world example, is the approach taken by General Stanley McChrystal in the Joint Special Operations Task Force in Iraq, as Jeff described earlier. McChrystal recounts how he and his task force did this in Team of Teams. They adapted to fight the insurgency by shifting from a centralized hierarchical organization to a dynamic reconfigurable network. They created shared context, and they pushed authority to information, not information back up to authority. They introduced decision-making at the edge. And here's what I think is most interesting about this story. McChrystal, as many of us probably would, assumed that this shift was going to allow the task force to make decisions more quickly, to get inside the decision cycle of the insurgents. It did. But he was surprised that it also led to better decisions. Decision-making at the edge leads to faster and better decision-making. And that's true in all kinds of organizations, not just ones that are fighting insurgencies. Now, Jeff, we know this isn't easy, right?
Right. As important and significant as we believe these trends are, we're also under no illusion that it will be easy for anyone to adopt any of these. So let's at least identify some of the common barriers, challenges, and obstacles we see to these, and frankly, almost any other new thing. In our experience, all of these are typical of any large, complex enterprise like the federal government. And though a couple are unique or special or have a twist when it comes to working in the federal government. We'll provide some thoughts on how to address these challenges a little later. So for right now, let's just get these adoption challenges out on the table so we know what we're dealing with. The number one challenge I consistently hear cited to moving forward with something is, come on, everybody say it with me, funding. If only we had a bigger budget, of course we could do it. And even if we do have the budget available, it might be years away before we get it. Quote, it's in the plan for FY 2027 is an actual quote from a story someone shared with me earlier this year about their efforts to get funding for a project. The second most common challenge I hear is acquisition. So let's be honest. It can take a long time to buy something in the federal government. For some procurements, the dates can resemble an evolutionary timeline. And the government wants to make sure of what it's buying. That's harder to do with fast-moving or new technologies and broad industry trends. It's a balancing act to get to the specificity needed while still moving at a pace where what you're buying is still relevant when you finally buy it. We know how important supportive leadership is for change initiatives. And if leadership buy-in isn't there, making any kind of meaningful progress becomes extremely difficult. And even if we do make progress, it's really hard to make those changes stick. If our leadership isn't willing to support these trends, we have to rethink our tactics for how to pursue them. And yes, this headband is in fact an actual product on Amazon that you could buy for $9.99. And then related to leadership buy-in, we may feel like we don't have the necessary authority to make changes in light of the bureaucracy or personalities or our organizational structure or policy. We may feel like we are the very resistible force pushing against the immovable obstacle. And then the last challenge we want to identify is some people aren't confident these trends are relevant to them or the mission they support for whatever reason. And if someone doesn't believe a trend is relevant to them, it's going to take some work to convince them otherwise. That's a totally fair perspective. Not all of the trends will be relevant to everyone in the same way. So Trent, do you have some thoughts on that?
I do, absolutely. You may agree with us that these trends are important, maybe, but maybe not. We think they are important. And at the same time, we acknowledge how difficult it is to predict the future, to be certain about what's going to happen next. Let's look at some examples. So Tom Watson, president of IBM, in 1943 felt that there was a global market for just 5 computers. And Some evenings, there's 5 computers running in my house alone. I'm sure some of you are faced with a similar environment. Marty Cooper invented the mobile phone, but he believed that it would never replace the wired telephone. It has in my life. I don't have a wired phone now, and I haven't for the past 10 years. Rely totally on the mobile phone. And it works quite well. I know I'm not the only one. Robert Metcalfe, made famous by Metcalfe's law, which states that the value of the network is proportional to the square of the number of nodes on the network. He was involved in the early years of the internet and predicted that it would fail catastrophically in 1996. Of course it didn't. We're using it right now to come together, share our thoughts with you. So we think these trends are relevant. We're seeing them have an impact in the organizations that we work with, in people that we talk to, and in the way organizations around us are changing. They're not changing all at once, but that change is happening. It's here. So we think of, and wanted to bring to your attention this quote by William Gibson: "The future promised by these trends is happening. Real companies are taking advantage of them. That future is not evenly distributed." Jeff, explain the choice that confronts us now.
Yeah, so Trent just shared several examples of really smart and accomplished people being wrong about some pretty big trends in hindsight. We could be wrong about these trends too. We don't think we are, but if you ask my wife, she would tell you I'm wrong a lot. If you think we're wrong, the responsible thing to do would be to ignore us and not move forward. However, if you think we might be on the right track, and the concern is that these trends aren't wrong, they're just difficult to pursue, then let me share this perspective with you. We've all been living in a time of profound disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, and it has taken a profound toll globally in all conceivable ways. And I'm not going to say there is good that came out of the pandemic, or, hey, let's look at the silver lining of the thing that caused the deaths of millions of people. I will share that I've had conversations with friends and colleagues about their observations that a lot changed within their workplaces that they never thought would or could change. In one case, they never thought their organization would support remote work. That changed. In another case, they never thought they would be able to take their equipment at work to use at home. That changed. Both of those stances changed in a matter of a week or two for their organizations. So given our shared experience with disruption and change over the last year, maybe changes we're contemplating now won't be as hard as they would be otherwise. So with that in mind, let's talk about how we might create some change related to these trends. We had a ton of ideas and experiences we wanted to include here, but had to boil it down to just a handful we thought would be most helpful to the most people. Hopefully at least one of these will pique your curiosity. But before sharing the specifics, we did want to share the perspective that you don't need all the right answers right now to get started. Your plan doesn't have to be perfect and complete and contemplate all the possible contingencies. The path forward is to take small steps in the right direction and realize that making things a little bit better makes things a little bit better. And if you string together enough a little bit betters, you make things a lot better. So let's get started with a couple of easy ones, addressing challenges with budgeting and acquisition. Many of the challenges we've discussed are addressed in the de-risking guide from GSA's 18F. We pulled this quote out from the guide because we agree with it 1,000%. In our experience, technology isn't the long pole in the tent for accomplishing our objectives. The technology exists to do almost anything we want. The problem is using outdated practices, principles, and mindsets for how we identify, acquire, use, and manage that technology. This guide has useful, sometimes countercultural, at least in the federal government, guidance for federal technology initiatives. A program you should also check out is the U.S. Air Force's Kessel Run. This program started in 2017 with the goal of bringing modern technology practices used by the private sector into the Department of Defense. Their mission is to deliver combat capabilities warfighters love and revolutionize the Air Force software acquisition process. They succeeded. I had the opportunity to visit Kessel Run last year. They've broken a lot of new ground in DoD and the federal government in general. There's a lot other agencies could learn from them about their engineering, leadership, and acquisition practices. I'll share with you a quote attributed to one of the generals associated with the program that sums up the philosophy there. When someone says, "This is how we've always done it," I hear, "This is how we lose the next war." Trent, take us through the rest of the recommendations.
Will do. I like books, so I'm going to share two that I like and have found valuable. It's about 10 years old now, but The Lean Startup by Eric Ries is full of good recommendations. It emphasizes creating testable hypotheses. That's the idea underpinning the concept of the MVP, or the minimum viable product. And throughout that process, you want to plan for learning. Build something small, measure its impact on the outcomes that you care about, and then use what you learn from that to decide what to do next. Build, measure, learn. You want to make sure that you're exploring and experimenting. And product teams, we talked about before, are a great way to make that kind of process flow easier, smoother, and to allow you to learn faster. Mark Schwartz's seat at the table is about his experience in the federal government as CIO of DHS's U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. He's got a wealth of recommendations, but some of the key ones are the use of lightweight business cases to align management teams and help make decisions more quickly, the adoption of more flexible acquisition approaches, use of open source software to gain advantage and bring in the best innovative thinking in the marketplace, and disciplined risk management approaches that work for the organization, mitigate it, and allow you to move forward quickly. Now, moving beyond books to specific techniques, one that I find extremely valuable is value stream mapping. It's an essential prerequisite for introducing product teams and shifting to a product orientation. But even if you're not ready for that step, value stream mapping can be really valuable. It can identify improvement opportunities, it can promote better cross-functional collaboration, and it can improve process efficiencies by eliminating waste and redundancy. I've done this with many organizations, federal, private sector, around the globe. And one of the most important things that comes out of this kind of an exercise is the shared understanding that emerges from the team and the people who put these maps together. In our experience, we've heard things like, wow, I never knew that was how all of this worked. Or I had no idea that that department had to go through all that to get the production work out the door. And when that learning happens, it's amazing because everyone gets a better understanding and they can begin to move forward together. And that's what we want to do, move forward together. But it's important, right? Don't try to do it all at once. Incremental improvements and sustainable pace are going to be most effective. Don't try to boil the ocean. And we recommend taking a lean startup approach to change. Think big, set real goals, something that will inspire people, but plan to learn along the way. Right? Start with a single team or a single program, pick one value stream, maybe just part of the value stream, get some momentum and grow it from there. Build on learning and success, create a culture where this becomes a habit. And along the way, we think it's extremely important to connect with others, like-minded people within your organization or the broader industry. Build a coalition of people who share your interest in improving and supporting the mission of government. Use these trends that we've discussed with you today to build a better future. Got an example for you. Right now, I am part of an informal group that's talking about how to use complexity science to develop better approaches to some of the most challenging problems we have in the federal government. It's been really exciting to see that group come together, discuss new ideas, and gain momentum just from the collaborative atmosphere that we've fostered. It's really inspiring. Jeff, how about you move on now and close us out?
Roger that. Okay. We have covered a lot of ground in a very short amount of time. We've shared stories from the past and the lessons we could learn from them, talked about big trends we see, identified challenges to adopting those trends, and even shared some thoughts about how to move forward. If you remember nothing else from this discussion, we want you to take away 3 key points. First, these trends aren't from some sci-fi future or mythical unicorn companies. We see examples of each of these trends in the real world producing real benefits for real enterprises today. And we've seen, second, we've seen these trends in use by companies in the private sector for commercial purposes. Basically, they're pursuing these trends to make a buck. I have nothing against making a buck, but how much more so should we be applying these trends to help the federal government and its mission to serve this country? That mission deserves the best. And then third, if we are to create meaningful change, we need to get engaged where we are. The more of us who do that, the bigger and better and faster that change will be. Now, we'd also like some help from you because we don't have all the answers. We'd really love to hear your perspective on trends we should have covered but didn't, and also information and resources about the trends we did cover that you found to be useful and valuable. Please share with us what you see. We'd like to learn from you too. And then if you've hung with us for this long, maybe we're like-minded and we should connect and talk more. We'd also love your help getting connected to fellow rebels, change agents, and like-minded individuals so we can learn from each other, share what works and what doesn't, and celebrate progress. And if nothing else, there's strength in numbers and value in knowing you're not alone. So we're excited and optimistic about the meaningful impact these trends could have on our government, our companies, our teams, and each of us as individuals. These trends hold a lot of promise if we can tap into them and take advantage of them to transform our future individually and collectively. And we all have the power to do that. So grab your sunglasses because we believe the future is bright. And now we'd love to hear thoughts and questions from all of you. What do you think about what we've shared? And what questions can we answer for you? And by the way, doesn't this sign leave you with some questions? So we'd love to hear from you. All right, so it looks like we've got one question coming in. What kinds of groups and councils do you recommend joining if we want to learn more about how to take advantage of technology in the federal government? Well, I'll give you just one thought right off the bat, and this is a nod to our host here, ACT-IAC. There's the Emerging Technologies Council. They're a great source of information about that. There's some really smart people involved in that group, and they're putting out a lot of content that's designed to both inform and educate federal employees and the companies that serve the federal mission about what those emerging technologies might be, and also maybe even more importantly about how best to tackle or take advantage of those trends, how to apply them to the actual mission of government. Trent, do you have any other thoughts about that?
Yeah, I wanted to add to that. I mean, you plugged it earlier, but I do think that it is a valuable thing to mention in answer to this question. Is the DevOps Days DC group, that would be a great thing to come and attend. And because one of the things that you've done in the past, and I assume you'll do in the future, is highlight how DevOps and its trends are influencing work in the federal government. So it's very much oriented to that kind of work. Agile DC is another local conference more oriented towards Agile, less to DevOps, but that also has a strong emphasis on improving the art of practice in the federal government. So those are two local conferences that I think would be quite valuable for people to consider attending.
Indeed, and that would also help with that other goal or recommendation, which is being able to connect with other like-minded individuals. So you're going to be able to learn and you're going to be able to connect at the same time. So a double win. All right, here's another one. Another question. Much of our organizational structure is fixed, meaning I think in place. It's not immovable. How can we take advantage of the ideas you spelled out with product orientation? Trent, that seems like one you should probably take.
Yeah, well, that harks back to what we talked about with USCIS and helping the verifications organization improve. So even though a lot of the existing federal structure might be fairly rigid, it is possible to staff and create teams within the constraints of that kind of a structure and that are cross-functional, that are product-oriented, and give them a specific mission. Like we talked about reducing the case backlog, we talked about improving case processing times. Those are specific organizational goals that those teams went after. And there was a strong partnership between us and the federal government, our teams, to make that work. So there are ways to do that. You can find cross-functional collaborative avenues that can be quite effective even within some of these constraints, just by starting some of the networking informally and adhering to the boundaries, the organizational constraints that force you to operate sometimes with a siloed mentality. But you can conform to that and then form bubbles inside of it that allow this approach to work. There's lots of different ways to do it.
And then to add to what Trent just said, one of the things in my experience that I've recognized is that there's oftentimes I'm just going to say two paths to making decisions or changing things. One is sort of the vertical path, and that really follows the chain of command, and that speaks to the leadership and the authority part. Those are really the formal structures of the organization and how decisions get made and implemented. But there's another path that I think a lot of people don't consider, or at least consider as much, and that is the horizontal influence-based path. And those are a lot more fluid and a lot less rigid than the more formal organizational structures. So going back to the building the coalitions, that's where that becomes so important, because you can create a lot of change through informal influence-based structures, really looking horizontally rather than vertically at the chain of command. So that would be another thing, again, back to the recommendation of building the coalition, is try to find other like-minded individuals or people at least oriented to the same goals and objectives that you are, and start to connect with each other to be able to advance the cause. Let's see. Another question. Are there resources available to learn about intelligent, composable teams? Now, I'm going to hand it off to Trent in just a second. I'm going to fire my shot here. The big one, obviously, is the one that we referenced in the talk, which is Team of Teams from General Stanley McChrystal. There's a lot of great principles in there. There are 4 of them. I'm not going to steal the thunder from the book, but there are 4 principles in there. Things like shared context, creating a shared context, that would be one of those principles. Creating an environment of trust, that would be another one. But I'm sure this is really Trent's area of expertise. So sure he'd be able to talk, maybe even for a whole other webinar about stuff like that.
We could. Yes, Team of Teams is excellent because it's a good story. And I really like how McChrystal sort of walks us along. You learn with him through the narrative. Other ways to approach that, I was just looking over at my bookshelf. There's a book called Organizing for Complexity by Niels Flagging. That is a good reference. He emphasizes creating modular groups within an organization that are cross-functional, where decision-making can occur at the edge, and gives a lot of tips, real-world tips about how to do it. It's a paperback book. It's relatively thin, maybe 120 pages or so. Another useful tool, if we think about how to do this in an IT organization, is a book called Team Topologies. It posits that there are 4 basic team types and a number of different interaction modes between them. What I really like about that perspective is how it anchors in the cognitive load that a team has. One of the one of the difficulties that we can run into if we try to make teams like this, the intelligent composable teams, is we could try to fit too much into them. You need to make sure that each team has a scope and some boundary so that it doesn't get too large and doesn't try to do too much. And Team Topologies gives some recommendations for how to do that. Another useful tool, we talked about this in the presentation, can be doing value stream mapping, because a lot of the times we will have organizations that are structured very functionally. As we understand more about how knowledge and work flows through organizations, as we understand those process flows, we can get a better idea for what the composable team units ought to be, what kinds of capabilities ought to be embedded within them, and then how they ought to collaborate together. So those are 3 additional resources that I think are quite useful.
Yeah, I told you he was smart, everybody. So I'm just going to put in one more plug for the Team Topologies book. I have found in a lot of conversations, particularly over the last year or so, I have been using that book a lot and referencing that book a lot in those conversations to help people understand how teams might fit together, what kinds of teams certain teams are, and maybe some restructuring opportunities to make things more effective, whether that's product teams or platform teams or support teams and things like that. So super fantastic book. Highly recommend it. Another question that came in, how are you integrating AI with all the current emphasis on cybersecurity? The short answer is very carefully, for sure. AI isn't. I don't know a better word to say other than a very interesting field, in that because it's so disruptive, because it's so transformational, there's a lot of new that's associated with it, including a lot of the threat vectors that come along with the use or the application of AI. And so stuff that we didn't often have to consider in the past, now we do. So, for example, we have to be looking at model security and how to make sure that that the models aren't being poisoned by incoming data, and so that the models stay true to their to the intent and apply all of the principles and that we want to see those models adhere to when it comes to ethics and privacy and security and things like that. So there are these new and novel threat vectors when it comes to the use of AI. So it does you do have to be very thoughtful about that and make sure that you're applying tools and practices and techniques into your technology ecosystem to make sure that you're protecting against those new threat vectors. I'll also say that a lot of the principles and practices that we've used for traditional software development also apply to the use of AI. So many organizations right now are into the DevOps movement, and they're doing things like continuous integration and continuous delivery, and they have CI/CD pipelines and things like that. So that's one of the ways that we make sure that we are applying and ensuring security for all of the things. It's the automated checks. It's baking things into the pipeline. It's mitigating risks through repetitive, consistent, frequent checks of all of the things that we're trying to check for. But it's a new and exciting field, and we're certainly trying to do everything we can to make sure that the good guys win on this one.
Just to add to that, Jeff, you emphasized that some of the principles and practices that we would employ with software development are the same, and I'd agree, but I do think that at a certain level, with AI, we have to make sure that we ground ourselves in the principles, because some of the practices might not fit perfectly. Like principles, rapid feedback loops, monitoring, ensuring that we can automate where it makes sense so that the human decision-making is involved in the process, the creativity is most effective and used most efficiently. And one of the things that I've found to be most interesting in working with more traditional software teams and also AI teams is how some of those practices have to morph a little bit in order to ensure a solid grounding in those principles. And that's something that is really exciting to watch as the work around AI matures and we get more sophisticated. But I think you've hit, especially on ensuring that models continue to serve the purposes that they were intended for, is one of the most important things to keep in mind when we think about AI and cybersecurity. So there's got to be a way to make sure feedback loops around the model and its operation itself to make sure it's doing what it needs to be doing and hasn't been compromised somehow.
Right, that's right. Got another comment, not a question. Good info. Thanks for the presentation. Hey, appreciate it. Thanks for that. And then another question. What use cases do you see for 5G and the federal government? Yeah, we talked about this a little bit. We touched on one commercial use case, which was the Volvo one, the remote operation of equipment. Honestly, I think that use case translates into the federal government too. So where the physical world, where do we see maybe remote operation of equipment or things? That would certainly be a use case for 5G inside the federal government. Kind of pulling back just a little bit, generally speaking, where we see 5G having a lot of applicability is also where Internet of Things or IoT use cases live. In the world of IoT, those devices are throwing off a lot of events, by the way, so that's where the event-driven architecture can come into. And that's why, even pulling back a little bit further, that's why we see this as a confluence of all of these trends, not necessarily individual trends. It's all of them working together. So 5G, Internet of Things, throwing off the events. And then when you get to AI, because you've now enabled the creation of all of the data, and you've been able to expand the communication pipes to be able to get the data from where it is to where it needs to be, you now start applying AI to that, and now you have much richer sources of data to be making decisions based on them. Again, it's a confluence of trends. But again, more generally, or more specifically about the use cases, so places where 5G might be applicable. So anytime there's a remote operation use case, so a person operating some equipment remotely, manufacturing, warehouse management, anytime that there's a mobile workforce involved. So think about sending teams out into the field to accomplish some mission objective, whatever that happens to be. There's use cases in agriculture. There's use cases in transportation, where you can put basically computers on things who are then communicating back in a much more frequent, higher bandwidth, higher fidelity way back to some maybe central authority to be able to process all of that information and make decisions. And then the reverse is also true. So now you could, because you have that extra pipe and the extra connectivity, you can actually be pushing stuff back out to the edge as well, which I think is I think that's really interesting in a way that we haven't seen, and that starts to touch on a lot of that intelligent intelligent composable business and how you enable pushing information, or sorry, authority to information, not information to authority. That was a lot of words. Trent, I don't know if you have any other thoughts about 5G and the federal government.
No, I've been nodding along here. I think at a high level, everything that you're saying makes a lot of sense. The use cases that I think are particularly relevant, I mean, there's lots of different ones that we could conceive of, but anything involving logistics, agriculture, especially if we're dealing with lots of stuff out there in the field where you need information gathering and you need to be able to make those kinds of decisions closer to the edge. Transportation is another good example. Obviously, all those things are encompassed, well, maybe not agriculture, but they fit into the Department of Defense and its charter. So there's a lot of potential use there. I think this fits quite nicely with this next question that we've got about thoughts on how to integrate vast amounts of disparate data from many areas or offices and agencies. This is the kind of problem that we have helped agencies with before. And for me, these are always quite interesting because, we collect a lot of data, collect a lot of information. One of the things that we have to get down to is, well, what's the information for? What do we want to do with it? Obviously, we're gathering it for a reason. So anchoring to that objective, that reason why we're gathering the data, how it can help us further our objectives is going to be essential. And that can inform what we can do. Because, Jeff, in the example you were just saying with 5G, right, there are circumstances where we want to push decision-making, we want to push authority down to the edge. So maybe one of the reasons we're gathering this information is so that we can collate it, we can make sense of it, and then we can enable someone in the field to be able to act faster, to seize, to recognize and seize an emerging opportunity more quickly. Well, that is a use case where it would be really valuable to use event-driven architectures, to use 5G, potentially even to push AI, some sort of AI model down to that edge so that we can make sense of those things there. Or maybe it's because we want to be able to make better centralized decisions in terms of, how does the agency allocate funds? Or how does the agency determine what its priorities ought to be and what to do next? And in that case, it makes sense to bring all this data together, filter it and collate it somehow so that we are surfacing the opportunities, either whether those are anomalies or standard ways of behaving, to enable better decision-making among the people who are responsible and empowered to make those decisions. That reminds me of what you were saying about the PTO.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is one of the things I love about Trent and me is we complement each other, because you took that question, the answer to that question, in a totally different direction. I love it. That's great. That's cool. Like I said, my wife tells me I'm wrong a lot, so, who knows? My take on this question is how to integrate vast amounts of disparate data. I think this is where AI can help, and we've seen this in practice in some of the work that we've done, including inside the federal government. So I'm just going to throw a couple of buzzwords out there for you. One is entity resolution, and the other was object graphs or entity relationship graphs. And both of those techniques can help with the data integration and the resolution and the connections and cleaning of data. Particularly in disparate data sources. So one of the problems that entity resolution tries to solve or attempts to solve is you've got the same logical thing that's living in two different places, but you're not really sure if that's the same thing. What's your confidence that that's actually the same thing? Classic example is a person with a name living in a particular address. Sometimes you have the middle initial, sometimes you don't have the middle initial, sometimes you have the number on the street transposed or something like that. Is that actually the same person? Now, in the past, without the use of advanced tools and AI, that would require a human oftentimes to to go through that and do the matching. Well, the problem with that is, number one, scale. How much you're doing that, how often you're doing that, how frequently you're doing that. That's a really expensive operation. And number two is, geez, I don't know if I would want that job to be able to do that or to have to do that all day, every day. So computers can do that a lot better. Now, they're not perfect, which is why you still need humans to be able to make oftentimes the final calls, is the human in the loop part. But it can help with that. And then the other, so that's the entity resolution issue. And the other one is the object graphing, or the entity relationship graphs. That's using computers to surface insights that might not otherwise be obvious, because, again, it would require a human to go through a lot of work to be able to do that due diligence or that research. So that's similar to what in that patent examiner use case at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, where it's supporting research into prior art. So instead of the examiner knowing what to search for and going into the vast body of knowledge that they have to search and look for stuff, you can use AI to be able to make that job a lot easier and be able to find information and make connections that you might not otherwise have been able to find. And so we see that that use case in a lot of cases. Just to belabor the answer. So another example would be in the case of like fraud, waste, and abuse. A lot of times you can get some really good insights about the risk associated with, say, a federal payment or a grant, based on the network of relationships involved in that payment. So there's the individual that person works for, there's other people that individual associates with, and be able to triangulate on all and connect all of those dots can provide some really interesting insights, again, about the level of risk that's associated with that payment, and be able to say, yep, we're good on this. There's really low risk of fraud, waste, and abuse, or like, maybe not so much. Maybe we need to do a little bit more homework on this one. I think we've hit all of the questions to one degree or another, and in various degrees or another. And given how close we are to the top of the hour, I think we probably ought to wrap up here. So let me just close this out here. We totally appreciate all the questions that we just got and the feedback. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. We know the time is precious, especially these days. So it means a lot. It means a lot to us that you did spend the time with us. We're looking forward to the next time we cross paths, hopefully sometime in the near future, maybe out in the actual real world, now that things feel like they're starting to open up again. Until then, stay safe out there. And with that, let me hand it back to ACT-IAC to close this out.
Thank you to all of the speakers for taking time to share with us today. And thank you to you, our audience, for joining us today.